Last week on this show, we discussed the lineage of a rifle called the AR-15.
So basically, the AR-15 is a centerfire semi-automatic firearm. The gun itself is a very common rifle in Canada.
Right now, the gun is restricted in Canada, meaning it has to be registered with the RCMP and can only be used on a firing range. Many gun enthusiasts want that to change. They petitioned the government to make it non-restricted, meaning it would be treated like any hunting rifle. But gun control advocates say there's nothing ordinary about the AR-15.
These things have a function as being part of a larger identity toolkit, a larger set of things that a person can use to construct a heroic, badass, masculine self.
Now, after that conversation, we heard from a lot of you. Matthew Lazenrider produced that segment, and he joins me now with some of your feedback. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Jim.
So what did people have to say?
Quite a few interesting emails, Jim. Many people agreeing with our guest, Rod Giltaca, that the AR-15 is essentially the same as any non-restricted semi-automatic rifle in Canada. So here's an email from a listener named Derek, and Derek writes, I own several bolt-action rifles that are now retired to peaceful recreation, but were very likely to have participated in horrible death and destruction during wartime. Should those be banned for their symbolic significance? The soldiers that carry these commonly available non-restricted firearms have killed people or been killed themselves. At war's end, these guns were refurbished, packed away, and then many years later sold to the public at very cheap prices. We make the argument that weapons of war have no place here, yet most of our fathers have hunted deer with the gun of empire and war, the Lee Enfield. The people who make arguments against military firearms are ignorant of the history of all firearms and therefore don't grasp the hypocrisy when they make it. Thank you for that email, Derek.
Okay, now here's an email from Kevin Harding, who signed the petition. He says the conversation about whether you can go hunting with an AR-15 is a distraction. And Kevin writes, hunting is not the only reason for guns in Canada or the USA. In fact, there are thousands and thousands of competitions held each year in both the USA and Canada, and the AR-15 is one of the best adapted and most common used firearms for these competitions. The reason why I voted and pushed for the AR-15 to be non-restricted is because I will be attending one of the largest shooting events in the USA, 460 shooters over 4 days of competition. Thanks to the AR-15's restricted status, I can't even train in Canada. I have to travel to the USA to train. Now, on the other side, we received this short note from Hillary Kemsley, who thinks if men are attracted to guns for their manly symbolism, there is a solution. And Hillary writes, listening to your show on guns this morning, an idea popped into my head. There's a simple way to interfere with the male ego-boosting aura attached to auto-firing guns. Enact federal legislation that those guns, with all of their add-ons, would be available in only one color: pink. There you go.
And the debate, of course, Jim, it's not just one side and the other. It's not just between gun owners and gun opponents. There are many shades of gray. Here's Tom Brose, gun owner and AR-15 opponent. And Tom writes, I was under the impression that it was restricted because of the common availability of parts to turn it into an M16. These parts can turn it into a better, more concealable killing machine than its parent, the M16. As a lifetime hunter and gun owner, I can see no real use for it other than to boost the ego of people who watched Rambo too many times. Maybe we should require psychological assessments as a first step in gun ownership. And thank you, everyone, for your emails. And Jim, Tom's email was interesting to me because I think a lot of people would be surprised at just how complex our gun laws are. Putting together the story I told last week, I had to learn a lot. And to be honest, I'm not a gun guy. I haven't spent a lot of time with guns. To be honest, I didn't know any semi-automatics were non-restricted in Canada at all. I thought any semi-auto had to be registered. You couldn't drive around with it or take it hunting. We got a tweet during the show last week that it was abhorrent that we were talking about semi-automatic rifles at all, but there are thousands of them in Canada legally owned and unregistered. So one of the things that really struck me about putting that story together was about how little I initially knew about those specifics and those gun laws in Canada. And I think a lot of us city dwellers would be surprised at what's legal and what's not in this country.
Okay. Well, Matthew, thanks again.
Thank you, Jim.
That's Matthew Lazen Ryder. Now, that learning process that Matthew went through is quite familiar to my next guest. Al Tompkins is a senior instructor at the Poynter Institute, a nonprofit journalism school and consulting company based in Florida. He makes it part of his work to give reporters on both sides of the border a working knowledge of guns. And he says most journalists simply have no personal experience with firearms.
Increasingly, of course, young people don't grow up hunting and they don't grow up target shooting and so on as they did, for example, when I was a young person. You know, your listeners might be even interested to know I grew up in Kentucky, a very rural part of the country. Mm-hmm. And where I grew up, we actually had a gun rack with 410 shotguns that you used in gym class in PE because it was important, you know, that you know how to shoot a gun. And
no dodgeball for you guys.
No, well, we had that too. But you know, it was just a part of everyday life. And so that's where I grew up. And a lot of people who grew up in the country still obviously know an awful lot about it. But if you think about where the media centers are, they're not in places where people go hunting. They're in cities. And so, you know, you tend to get a lot more journalists who come from sort of a city background than a country background, just because that's where the TV stations and the radio stations are.
Of all of the things that journalists say about guns, what are the elements they get wrong that stick out for you?
Well, most often the biggest confusions come in what is an automatic versus a semi-automatic weapon. And quite often they sort of overstate how often semi-automatics, particularly the AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, is used in mass crimes. So first of all, they don't know the difference between these different kinds of weapons. They don't understand calibers and gauges. Mm-hmm. So it's largely sort of the verbiage that they get wrong, and they also don't fully understand which weapons are most commonly used.
So why is it that journalists appear to feel comfortable writing about guns and about gun laws without actually knowing much about guns?
Well, I don't know if they all are comfortable writing about guns and gun laws, but you know, we as journalists, you have to cover a lot of stuff, and sometimes you know a whole lot about it, and sometimes you have to find people who know a lot about it. What sometimes happens is we talk to people who give us information, and journalists sort of have this idea that if they get somebody for it and somebody against it, then they've got sort of a whole picture. And that, of course, isn't always the truth. Sometimes both sides can be misinformed. So they've got to become more educated about this subject, and they have to make an effort to actually do that, which is one reason why I do a lot of training of journalists around guns and gun issues. It's a complicated subject and it's full of nuances. You can't just come kind of close to it. You've got to get it right, because there's so many people who know this subject very well, and they will call you out on it.
It's interesting you said that. It flashed back to a time when I was working for a magazine, and I was talking to somebody who said to me he really liked the magazine. He used to buy it every month until one time there was a story in it about a subject that he knew a lot about, and he noticed so many things wrong in that story that he couldn't believe anything else they were writing about.
My father had a saying that you make your reputation over time and you lose it overnight. And I think that in today's media environment, it travels even faster than that. The other thing that happens on contentious stories like gun law is you tend to look for voices that agree with what you believe already. It's similar to politics. So it's a rare person indeed who will listen to this interview and change their mind because of something that you or I said. It's a rare person indeed. What we tend to do when we listen to media or read media is look for voices and ideas that are similar to our preconceived notion. A part of that I think, is that we sometimes penalize people who change their mind as being, sometimes we use the word flip-floppers. I would rather think about somebody who changes their mind based on the evidence as being open-minded, but that's not the way we think of things these days.
Now, you work with journalists. You try to improve their literacy when it comes to writing and doing broadcast pieces about guns. What do they tell you after you've worked with them and they've gone out and done subsequent stories? What kind of reaction do they bring back to you?
Well, sometimes journalists find that they are more aggressive, not less aggressive in covering the story when they have confidence. It's not unlike a skilled surgeon, right? A surgeon with a lot of skill is going to be more aggressive in diagnosing and going after the problem. And the same is true with a journalist or anybody with more skill, is that you're willing to go after tougher stories, tougher problems, because you understand the nuances and you have the confidence to be able to tread into those areas. So one reason why we want people to be more literate is because they'll be more aggressive. And the problem with all of these stories of any public policy is that we're not aggressive enough for the right reasons. We're not aggressive enough in covering the story to smoke out the nuances and find the weak ideas because we don't know enough to ask those questions. So much public policy around guns and gun control is based on misinformation or the lack of understanding. So those, for example, who would regulate the AR-15 fail to state that the AR-15 is rarely used in mass murder. By far, the more common weapon used in mass gun deaths is the semi-automatic pistol, most particularly the 9mm. But rare is the person indeed who wants to get rid of pistols. They're going after the scary-looking AR-15 because that's what they're told or that's what they believe is the problem. It simply isn't statistically.
Al Tompkins, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Al Tompkins is a journalism instructor at The Pointer.